Good morning, everyone, and it's great to see you here. Thanks again to Jürgen for inviting me. And also, I need to definitely thank the internet for this opportunity, because I never would have thought 6 years ago that I'd be standing here on this stage addressing you all. So, you can probably see something about me, and this is one prop, but I'm wearing thongs, as they're known in Australia, or flip-flops, as you'd call them in Germany. And Australians do tend to do some strange things, and I know it's October, I know it's cold and wet and grizzly outside, but if you're ever in Sydney, in the middle of winter, you will always find someone, more than one person, who's always going to be wearing Havaianas, even if it's thunderstorming, raining. So I thought, I've got to add an authentic Australian touch here to my talk in Berlin this morning. So I'm here to share a couple of stories that were based on this post that I wrote a couple of months ago. And it's really about what I found shocking about Berlin. So a couple of ways to kind of share with you how these last 6 years have been, and also to kind of explore how different people, when they come to a new country and are from a completely different culture, what they find shocking. So what might be shocking to one person in one culture could be completely normal and acceptable in another, hence why I wanted to wear my Havaianas on stage. And I think it's also a very timely topic, shock, given what we're witnessing, not just in Europe or Germany, but right here on our doorstep in Berlin with this refugee crisis and the whole humanitarian disaster. And we've heard so many shocking things about these people and the shocking conditions that they've left in the face of war and persecution. And I had my neighbor, who's a photojournalist, has shared some of her photos, and I just wanted to kind of start with this from her work at the Wilmersdorf Heim. But these photos are not as shocking as the one that we definitely all know about, that young 3-year-old boy who was washed ashore on the coast of Turkey. So what is shock? Well, again, I have to say I'm not a psychologist or a psychotherapist, so I'm not going to go into any kind of medical issues with shock. And my experience is really, it was an acute emotional experience to shock. So in terms of invisible things, so things that were not so immediately obvious, cultural, social norms, decisions that had been made that still affected my life, but also visible things. So the city, Berlin, the people that live here, the things that they do, the food that they eat. So this was kind of my shock reaction to these invisible and visible stimuli. But before I go on, just by way of an introduction, what is shock? If we take a kind of a classic dictionary definition, it has its roots in Old French. So this verb choquer, to strike against, or even the Middle French word choc, which has meaning of a violent attack. So it's really had this military kind of connotation. And then it was only in the kind of 19th century that shock began to have this kind of medical meaning, whereby the growth of mental institutions and asylums and the treatment of people in confined spaces led to shock being used in a medical sense. And then in the 20th century, we had the growth of this shock therapy for patients. So interestingly, when I had thought about what I was going to say, I also wanted to kind of bring in a couple of other languages and how shock is really explored for other languages apart from English. So in German, shock is spelt the same, but there's a couple of other synonyms for shock that I haven't listed up there. So there's words like Erschütterung, Elektroschock, Getreidebündel, and all these kind of words that have this very electricity, engineering, electrocution type precision to describe another level of shock. Spanish also uses shock, same spelling, also masculine. French has retained its old French meaning, spelt in the same way. And in Russian, if you can just pretend I'm Anna Karenina or someone with a name like Tatiana, shock is really just Cyrillic letters that are being transposed from English. So, and then in Hebrew and Yiddish, a friend of mine told me there wasn't really a specific word for shock, but the closest there is Gewalt, and it's used in a very specific expression, which is Oi Gewalt, and that is, oh, something terrible has really happened to me. And interestingly, as we do know, you're all mostly German speakers, that Gewalt in German is more kind of force or aggression. So, what exactly shocked me about Berlin? Well, I'll start with the visible aspects of what shocked me. And the first thing I have to say that shocked me was the difficulty in finding a job. And I know I'm not alone here, but I had come from Sydney, and this was in 2009 in the height of the global financial crisis. And I just was surrounded by people back in Sydney who had either been so consumed with their work, and all of a sudden so many people were losing their jobs, and then having this experience whereby they were in a very expensive city and kind of felt this very much of a social stigma in being suddenly made redundant from their job. And then contrasting that with coming to Berlin and being exposed to this whole new world of people who worked part-time, they were working mini jobs, they were project consultants, they were working in a co-working space, they were Praktikanten, they were doing their second or third degree, they were doing a PhD, they were on some kind of parental leave, sick leave. So there was this whole kind of different approach to work and jobbing, something that was very foreign to me. And as a result of kind of having this experience of finding a job, I kind of, like most new arrivals, also cobbled together and you know, took great pride in kind of using 2 or 3 job titles also for my business card or my email. So I just looked around and saw what other people were doing. I thought, okay, back-end developer, writer, consultant, why not put it all together? And that was the point at which LinkedIn then really came to hate me, because I wasn't just a one person with one particular job description. And so I suppose that first kind of shock was about that job kind of issue. And as we saw last week with the Day of German Unity, 25 years since German reunification, and I really feel how incredibly far Berlin has come. But I also kind of thought there's kind of a little bit of a way to go, because the history and division of this city just completely made such an impact, and the lack of the industry, I think, was something that also had shocked me, and which is probably why I then wanted to kind of figure out how these gaps were being filled. And so we've all seen this influx of companies, the Airbnbs, the Googles, and then this kind of category of person, the itinerant professional, who comes to Berlin for a period of time, learns a bit of German, gets their apartment at Neukölln or Kreuzberg, and is here for a time, and these people somehow become like the bane of most Berliners' existence, because they're blaming them for increasing rent prices or contributing to gentrification in certain areas. So I feel, yes, that was kind of like my first main shock. And I, oops, oh, hang on, where did I go back? The other part of what I felt in Berlin was this whole concept of, oh, sorry, I thought my slides were all wrong. No? Okay. So the second part of what I experienced was, I guess, the invisible side of what could be invisible shocks. So for me, this really came down to German taxes. and no other country in the world produces as much tax literature, gazettes, regulations, protocols, rules about taxes. And the first thing that really shocked me was that Germans still pay church tax in the 21st century. So a portion of all of our hard-earned euros goes towards supporting cassocks, congregations and candles, unless you want to willingly excommunicate yourself from this institution. And you've got to do that through an official application form. So my husband actually decided he'd had enough, and as a good confirmed Catholic, he wanted to excommunicate himself and rather devote his energy to other causes that he felt were more meaningful. But as all things in German fashion, there was a very official way to excommunicate from the church with this whole form. Got to submit it to the Finanzamt. And then a couple of months later, we received a letter, or he did, from the local parish priest, kind of really bemoaning his decision to exit the church. I just wanted to ask a question. So I'll backtrack. So in terms of taxes, there was that. Then there was also this thing called the Solidaritätszuschlag. And I kind of thought, okay, what is this? And it was explained to me that as part of the reunification of Germany, the Neue Bundesländer, so Brandenburg, Thuringia, Saxony, Sachsen-Anhalt, and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, had a portion of people's taxes that they received in order to help them rebuild their infrastructure, so roads, schools and houses, hospitals, etc. And I found that I'd never heard of this before in any of the former communist countries, and I thought this is something that's incredibly unique. And one day, a couple of years ago, when my husband was working out at Saxony-Anhalt in an area called Solar Valley, which is kind of the renewable energies capital of Germany, I wanted to go and just kind of have a look at this area. And there's one particular spot called Bitterfeld, which used to be quite an industrial hub back in the days of the DDR. And even before that was where BASF produced most of its products. But when I saw this photo, well, I took this photo, and when I saw this town, I kind of thought, where is this Solidaritätszuschlag actually going? What has happened to this place? It was just such a far cry from what I thought of as Germany and all these kind of Schloss Neuschwanstein and the romanticism of Heidelberg. This just did not concur at all with what I had envisioned Germany to be. Then we have this. Another shock for me was this, Spargel. The shrine to Spargel. So in terms of food culture, this celebration, pride and joy in this vegetable, this phallic vegetable that is only in season for between 5 to 8 weeks per year, how it was that this became to dominate people's daily dinner conversations, dominate when people were going to have parties because they had to make sure they had enough pots to boil their Spargel for all their friends. Why this vegetable was just such a big thing, and how it became, and how it is this kind of evil marauder, where it is on every single menu. You've got Spargel spaghetti, Spargel Schinken, Spargel Suppe, Spargel crepe, Spargel pancake, all manner of Spargel. And it was a shock to me because in Sydney you can pretty much get any fruit or vegetable 365 days of the year. So it's really not a big deal to have this little vegetable boiling in your pot for 6 weeks of the year. Likewise, the humble strawberry also has a very short season in Germany, and I really found it kind of, it was quite shocking because you're going around at the time of the strawberry season with people kind of breaking out into oral orgasms because of the explosion of taste in their mouth from this berry. The other aspect of food culture that I found quite shocking was how affordable things really are. And at my local cafe at Schoneberg at Double I, the coffee, up until a few months ago, still cost €1.80. Now the owner has increased that to €2 as of a couple of months ago. So I think that's quite a remarkable price in this day and age. Okay. Oops, sorry, too quick. So I just wanted to turn to some other kind of invisible things that shocked me. And these were the things that were not so immediately obvious upon my arrival in Berlin. The Labo. Maybe that doesn't mean much to many of you, but it's essentially the office for foreign aliens. So it's where people like me go to be reminded that we're Ausländer, that we're a Gast. So it's where you go to renew your visa or your working permit. And it probably is the most miserable place in Berlin. And it's a grey, nondescript building. I didn't even think it's worthy of a photo for this presentation. And it's a place where me and no doubt thousands of other people have gone and shed so many tears because your fate hangs upon one person who's sitting there, mostly completely disinterested in who you are, what you have to say, mostly very tattered up, very kind of plucked straight out of the 80s. They're the people who decide if you stay or go. Upon my most recent visit to the Labo in April of this year, I, by some miracle, landed a really lovely case manager, and she was very professional, very caring actually, and offered me an 18-year extension on my residency. And that was probably because I've done my duty for the Vaterland. So through having a child and now another one, and she even offered me the benefits of what German citizenship could bring to me. And then kind of said, I'm sorry, but ich kann nicht Ihnen weiterhelfen, das ist nicht meine Abteilung. And so I then kind of took that as a really positive thing in comparison to some of the other experiences that I'd had at the Labo. Another thing that I wasn't so kind of able to appreciate until I got here was these invisible, the social norms and customs. And particularly conversations I've had with my Bavarian sister-in-law about women and work. And she introduced me to this interesting term known as the Rabenmutter, which I had never heard about before. So the Rabenmutter is the raven mother. It's the mother who leaves her chicks in the nest and goes off to work. And it was something that was very shocking to me because in my family back in Sydney and in most of my circle of friends, it's just a really normal thing that a mother works and is not necessarily a terrible mum, but it's just an accepted part of the social and economic reality. And when my sister-in-law told me about this Rabenmutter thing, I kind of just didn't know how to respond. And so the family and kind of social policies that are at the heart of a lot of German kind of ways of life was also something that I was really shocked about. On the other hand, because of that, I kind of felt when I saw and still do see German dads that they've benefited from that Rabenmutter. They're so emancipated. German dads cook, they clean, they braid hair, they toilet train babies, they take kids to school, they are happy for their kids to have the surname of their wife or partner. These were things that were just, for me, compared to the average Australian John or Joe, was just miles and miles, light years ahead. Some other kind of invisible things that were shocking to me were more of these kind of social norms. Things like you can bike ride without a helmet, you can drink and be completely free to have a beer or whatever you like to have on the street. Don't have to wrap it up in a brown paper bag so you don't feel like an alcoholic. There's no CCTV surveillance, barely anywhere, so your movements are not tracked and recorded, which is something that back in Sydney is completely commonplace, and you don't even flinch if you might be sitting in a venue like this and there'll be 10 or 12 CCTV cameras watching you drink your coffee. And so these kind of things which I really wrapped up together were kind of my experience of shock. How am I going for time?
3 more minutes.
Good. So that's kind of my part of the talk where I wanted to share a couple of these stories with you. There's also a crowdsourced element to this talk. I had asked and put a call out on social media for friends just to send me pictures of what they thought you here in the audience could potentially find shocking about aspects of life in Sydney. So, which is a task that was easier said than done, because not everyone's a professional photographer, but I didn't expect that. I just had said, if you can send me something, email it, iPhone it, or message, whatever. So I have the results of my experiment. And the first photo on the left is, you'll see it says, location is Villawood Detention Centre. And the source was Wikipedia, but it was sent to me by a friend. And this place might not be particularly special, but it was singled out because it's a place where in Sydney, it's about 20 kilometres from the Opera House. If you overstay your visa, you've arrived illegally into the country by boat, you've committed some kind of immigration crime, then you're placed in detention. You're not free to move around and come and go as you please, as most of these people who we've seen coming to Berlin are free to do. They arrive, they go to Legesel, they register, they go to Wilmersdorf or Moabit. They can come and go as they please, but at this particular Villawood Detention Centre, you're not free to go. Secondly is a picture in an inner city suburb called Redfern. That is where my university still is located. And this was singled out by my friend because simply to show you that it's just such a stark contrast between the wealth of the city in the background and here at the front. It's a part of the city where a lot of Indigenous people live as well. So she kind of felt it's a strong statement about how the white kind of culture of Australia just does not interact at all with the Indigenous population. So that's kind of an ongoing problem in Australian society. The third photo, the last one on the left, might just look like a girl who's passed out on a picnic blanket, but it's actually a little bit more than that. This whole kind of binge drinking culture, which is such a big part of Australian culture, it's so mainstream, I can't even explain why. It was singled out by Claire because she found it on this Instagram account. And the Instagram account is called Drunk Girls of Melbourne Cup and has 25,000 followers. Essentially, it's pictures that were being taken at Australia's largest horse race, the Melbourne Cup, which takes place every year in November. And it's just a collated pictures of people who've passed out or are drunk or kind of vomiting at this horse racing festival. And again, it's just to kind of show that it's just such a mainstream part of culture, and people actually, the way that the Germans celebrate Spargel, I think Australians we can say that Australians really celebrate their drinking in a very similar fashion. So that brings me to the end of my kind of formal talk, and I hope just through sharing a couple of these stories with you that, from my experience here, plus also this part of life in Sydney that I've kind of beamed into Berlin, it's just a nice platform that we can perhaps have an interesting conversation, and it's just one version of shock. So I'll end it there, and I'm happy to take comments or questions, queries.
Thank you very much.